Hello, everybody. Thank you so much for joining us today. This is Brantley Pierce here at the Work Institute. We're excited to get this kicked off. I'm also joined by our president, Danny Nelms. Danny, you want to tell everybody hi?
Good morning, everyone, or good afternoon, wherever you are. Thanks so much for joining us.
Good deal. Well, hey, we want to make a good use of everybody's time. We have a whole lot of information to go over in this session today, so we're going to dive right in. Obviously, we have the comments section, so if there's something that you're really itching to know, we'll try to get to that by the time our time is done here, so feel free to comment there. But without further ado, I think we're just going to dive right in into this presentation, the top reasons why your employees are leaving. So, of course, I can't get the clicker to work. There we go. But we'll dive right in. So, in 2018, over 41 million employees left their jobs. So that is a staggering number. And if you're anything like me, I really don't know what to compare that to. It's such a big figure. But the reality is that number is equivalent to the populations of the 25 largest cities in the United States. That's how many employees left their jobs voluntarily in 2018. So it's a huge number. And if you're just going by conservative estimates, it's costing the U.S. economy or the U.S. employers over $60 billion or $600 billion in turnover costs. So not only is it happening a lot, it's expensive. So the good news is, here at the Work Institute, is we're able to conduct over 37,000 exit interviews last year. So we were able to capture some of the reasons why employees were leaving and start noticing some trends and data behind that. So we have a unique approach. We'll get into that here further in a minute about how we collected this data, but it's in a conversational format. It's a little bit different than a survey. So when you can imagine, when you're talking to the American public about their work experiences, you get some interesting remarks. So I wanted to start off the presentation by sharing with you all just a couple of really great quotes we got from employees who had left their jobs. So here's the first one that I am a real big fan of here. Is that the employee says, I left because I got arrested and I resigned. So it seems like that happened probably pretty sequentially, right? I get arrested and get resigned. But my favorite part of this person's quote is they said, I was in jail for 2 or 3 weeks. I don't know about any of you on the webinar, but if it were me and I were in jail, I would know exactly how long I was in jail for. It's not 2 or 3 weeks. It's 10 days, 5 hours, and 21 minutes. There's going to be no doubt about it. So it's just wild, wild stuff. So, and of course, this person's response, I texted my supervisor to tell them and they never got a text back. Imagine that. Your supervisor ghosting you after you let them know you're in jail. Just weird behavior, correct? So that's the first one. The second one that I really, really enjoy is I left because we had a meeting in which we were introduced to our new office manager, Helen. Helen, the new office manager, was my husband's ex. So can you imagine just the heartburn this lady had going into this meeting? Probably a lot of angst and something that just a little bit of a background check could have avoided there. But anyhow, I love the verbatims that we get. Some of them are very specific like this and tell some great stories. But also want to talk about a quick story about, you know, the reality is the job market's tough. We're going to talk about that further, but there is hope and there are things you can do. And Danny, I wanted you to, if you could, share a quick story. I know we have a particular client we worked with that really made some great improvements around turnover, and they were able to save conservatively over $1.3 million in turnover costs. Dan, can you share with us about that?
Absolutely. You know, Brantley, you know, a lot of times as we're talking to companies, and I do a lot of this speaking across the country, and there's sort of 2 narratives going on. And the narrative from human resources is that people leave because of the manager. So we sort of toss that over the fence that they leave because of the manager. The managers all say they leave because of money. And so what I see is that we've got this narrative that just bounces back and forth in the organization, that it's either about money, it's either about the manager. And what we seldom do is get the data that actually tells us the truth and what are the real reasons. And so for this particular organization, kind of a mid-sized health system up in Indiana, they started to conduct high-quality exit interviews with us. And what we were able to find out is that neither the narrative about the manager or the narrative about the money was really the biggest drivers. And it really came down to 3 things. One was the job characteristics, in which the job itself was very different than what they expected. Number 2 was really the onboarding process and just feeling like they were kind of thrown to the wolves, if you will, and there was really no joining the company, especially from kind of a social aspect. And then number three was related to kind of a career ladder. This particular issue was related to first-year nurse turnover, and their first-year nurse turnover was 34%. So 1 out of every 3 nurses that were actually being hired were leaving within the first year, and those were the 3 primary reasons. So what was able to happen is once they identified those 3 things and then specifically put solutions in place, so they rebuilt their orientation process, made sure it was long enough, made sure all of the elements were there, built a nurse career lattice so that in fact nurses could see where their career could go, and that was just a document. It wasn't that they made major changes to the process itself, but at least letting them know where they could go. And then maybe most importantly, they rebuilt the selection process. So they included more people who were given a very strict charge of making sure that they gave a realistic job preview. And when they did those 3 things over the course of 3 years, their first-year nurse turnover went from 34% to 19%. So a dramatic improvement in that first-year turnover because they got the data, they got the truth, and then they acted on it.
So again, there is hope. A lot of times in an organization where there's high turnover, people can feel a bit adrift or maybe helpless. But with some intentionality and some focus and some good information, can make all the difference in the world. So everything we're covering today is being drawn from our work on our 2019 retention report. This is the 3rd time we've released this annual report, and it's interesting that the trends that we're seeing are kind of continuing to go in the same route. So this year we put a different spin on it, and we added the tagline, a call to action. Because the reality is that if we as employers don't do something around this turnover issue, the problem is going to continue to get worse. So everything you're going to see in here is in that report. If you'd like a copy of it, it's available for download on our site. If you need it more specifically, you can respond to one of the emails you've gotten around this webinar, and we can send it to you. So a few key takeaways from the session today. We're going to talk about the state of the marketplace as it relates to the labor market, trends in employee turnover, how we uncover the truth, so a little bit about our methodology, how did we get this data, the reasons for leaving, some additional insights, and then a call to action. So that's the plan from here moving forward with, in our time today. And at this point, I'm going to hand it over to Danny to cover the state of the marketplace.
Yeah, thanks again, Brantley. The marketplace is really, really intriguing, and I find myself having become a little bit of a workforce data nerd over the last 3 years or so. I find this information really, really fascinating. But I think that it's really important that and most of you on this call, I think, are HR professionals, but that we understand the market conditions. And a lot of times we actually get asked to come into companies and present this data because we have to understand the challenges that we're facing. And it's not overly complicated from the standpoint of we've got a demand and supply issue. We have more demand than we have supply of employees. And that demand looks a little bit like this. Since 2010, it just continues to creep up. And this is data reported by the Bureau of Labor Statistics in terms of open jobs. In December of 2018, we had about 7.3 million. There's been a little bit of updating. In January of this year, we had 7.6 million open jobs, and then it settled back down. I think we're sitting at about 7.1, 7.2 right now. But since March, I think, of 2018, every month we've had over 7 million open jobs in the U.S. And of course, we all know the story around unemployment. It just continues to go down. The last jobs report reported 3.6% unemployment. I'll get the words out in a minute. And that drop just continues to fall, and their Fed is actually projecting that could get into the 3.2, 3.3 range at some point over the next 2 to 3 years if certain things don't change. And when you put the two things on a trend line here, and here we're not looking at percentages, we're actually looking at numbers. So we're looking at the number of open jobs, and we're looking at the number of unemployed people. And when we do that, what we end up with is this, what we call a tipping point. And this is where the demand is, in fact, outpacing the supply, at least the supply of unemployed workers. And so when this occurs, the place that we're going to try and attract our employees are from other employers. So it gets incredibly difficult. And we've heard for years about the war for talent. And this truly is a war for talent, because the only place to get employees is to put do everything you can to attract them from another company. And this is where our costs continue to go up as well. So, it just gets more and more expensive to lose employees. And Brantley said at the outset that we've got about $600 billion in turnover costs. We estimate about $15,000 per termination in turnover costs, and about a third of that are hard costs. So if you were just looking at a third of this number, you would have $200 billion in hard costs that employers are spending based on employee turnover. If it doesn't, and Brantley again mentioned this, if we don't start to do something, and this has been a real change in our messaging, is that we've got to act. It just feels, we talk to companies weekly, and it just feels as though companies are waiting, and we can't figure out what they're waiting on. And if they continue to wait, it is only going to get worse. And we're projecting by 2023 that some 54 million employees could be leaving their jobs voluntarily. Now, with all that in mind, this is kind of how we feel. And I realize that this puts, hiring or employers in a precarious position, but guess what? Employees are in control. This was actually a real Fortune magazine back in the late 90s. Yo, corporate America, I want a fat salary, a signing bonus, and a cappuccino machine. And oh, by the way, I'm going to bring my bird to work. I know this is the way we feel, but this is our reality. And, employees are a seller in a seller's market. So we have to realize that we have to create the conditions in our companies to both attract, but more importantly, retain our workers, because they're harder and harder to find out there. The good news is that we believe 3 and 4 of the reasons for leaving are actually what we consider more preventable. We don't say completely preventable because we know there's always nuances to a lot of things, but we think they are more preventable. They're things that companies can actually do. And so we need to be doing more. There are opportunities. And I want to look at this trend real quick because it really tells a story from my perspective. We think of things like career development, work-life balance, job characteristics, the work environment. These are 4 areas that we see as being very controllable by the employer. We can help employees to develop their career. We can help them to move forward. We can invest in their growth. Work-life balance is all about scheduling and flexibility. Job characteristics are very much about making sure the job is what was expected, especially in the hiring process. And of course, we know we can manage our work environment itself. Well, all 4 of these areas are trending up over the last 6 years, whereas things like retirement and involuntary terms are trending down. So the things that we have a lot of control over continue to be more and more the reasons employees are leaving. And this sort of brings us back to our overall message is, what are employers doing? And all we can think of is they aren't doing anything. And we're just willing to accept the status quo, and we literally have to be doing more. Now, one of the things that I think a lot of you probably would ask is, how do you know all this? How is it that you know that the information you're providing is accurate? And, I'm sure you've seen a lot of reports out there telling you about why employees have left. And I'm going to be a little critical here, but if a recognition company is putting that information out, they're going to say that they're leaving because of recognition. And if a management training company is putting that information out, they're leaving because of the manager. So much of the data that we see is biased based on how it's being collected. And that's one of the things that the Work Institute works really hard at, is to make sure that we know scientifically and methodologically how to collect data that's accurate. So there's a couple of things that affect authenticity of an exit interview. The first is the timing. And science tells us that at least 2 weeks after departure is the best time to collect the truth related to why an employee left. And I've talked about this literally to thousands of people, and everybody kind of logically gets their head around it. Yes, they're going to be less intimidated. They are not going to burn bridges. They've had time to think about it. They can be more objective. And yet 80% of all companies are still conducting exit interviews on or before their last day of employment. And so why? Why is it that we continue to do something that we logically can make sure or work our way through and realize isn't giving us the best data, and then relying on that bad data to make change? So we got to do things differently. Secondly, a third party. 40 to 63% of the reasons for leaving will be different when done by a third party and at least 2 weeks after they've left. So 40 to 63%, that is a massive number. It means half the information that you're getting is probably not accurate. So there's a right way and a wrong way to do exit interviews. And lastly, these open-ended questions. So Brantley at the outset talked about these conversations that we have. So one of the things that we don't do is we don't limit the scope of what we can learn. What do I mean by that? Well, we ask the simple question, why did you leave? And we let the employee tell us in their own words why they left. And then we take the onus on us to code and categorize, put that in the appropriate theme so that we can report it back out to our customers. So we've discovered that there are 50 distinctly different reasons why employees leave, and we're able to collect all of that information because that's what we need to be acting on, and we need to be acting on the truth. These are scientifically validated questionnaires, and honestly, we know what we're doing because we've done over 500,000 of these since 2000, so I think we're pretty good at what we do. At this time, I'm going to turn it back over to Brantley. We wanted to make sure you guys got to hear a couple of voices today. You get bored of Brantley or bored of Danny. So, but, you know, the reason you all joined today is to hear about these reasons for leaving. So, Brantley, take it away and let's talk about those.
Absolutely. So we'll start off with kind of a broad summary of the different categories. So you can see here in looking at the categories for reasons why employees leave, career development far and away is the leader of the pack, and we'll spend a little bit more time on that. But one thing I always love to point out is the things you see with the asterisks by them are what we would consider less preventable, to what Danny mentioned earlier of the more preventable versus less preventable reasons for leaving. You can see that these less preventable reasons, involuntary, retirement, relocation, are becoming a smaller and smaller percentage of why employees are leaving. And this is where the action part kicks in. All these other elements, while we know you can't wave a magic wand and fix everything, we do know there are things that every organization can do to improve in some of these buckets to help around employee retention. So without further ado, we'll hop into the 7 categories a little bit deeper. So category number 1, lack of growth and development opportunities continues to rise. So type of work is the leader in this category, and Danny alluded to this earlier around new hires. We found out, and you hear the old adage, right? You hire slow, you fire fast. And what we're finding is that we just, as employers, have maybe not done a great job of heeding that advice. So take your time, slow down, make sure you provide realistic job previews. We're not going to be able to solve all the world's problems on this one call, but because this is the biggest percentage in the biggest category, we always want to stop and emphasize that. But as it relates to trends, one that is skyrocketing is this lack of growth and development opportunity. So it's a big percentage and it's going up by quite a lot. The biggest reason for that is that, well, there is the assumption that a lot of people leave because they're not getting promoted. And while some people do leave for that, this growth and development opportunity is unrelated. The growth and development opportunity means that employees want to be grown and developed where they're at in the organization currently. So we're talking about things like continuing education, special project opportunities, ways that they can expand their skill sets or use different skill sets within the organization. They want to know that the company's invested in them, even if that doesn't always mean they're getting a title change. And I think this is something that most organizations can do. We just have to sit down and be a little bit more proactive about it. But on the flip side of that coin, this no advancement or promotional opportunity, that's actually becoming less of a motivating factor for people to leave. And I think this is because a lot of organizations have become flat. People know they're not always going to skyrocket up the ladder, but they want to know that they can grow and develop even if they're not being promoted through the ranks every single day.
And Brantley, I think one of the things that we need to always remember, and I'm going to go back to this action theme that we have, is that these two things require different interventions. It requires us to act in a different way. It requires us to do things differently. So if we just simply take this broad career development theme and trying to attack that problem just from an overall career development, typically what we think about from a career development standpoint is in fact this no advancement. But as we can see from the more minute data, for lack of a better word, the minutia in there, it actually needs to be solved in a different way.
Yep. So I'm a big fan of our verbatims. I showed you some of them earlier. We wanted to highlight some quickly in each of these categories so you can see what kind of things are employees saying as they leave around these different topics. I was an employee of the company for years, and they continued to hire people from outside the company for jobs I was qualified for. If you've been in HR for any period of time, I'm sure you've seen this play out. And a lot of companies really try to promote internally, but always consider when there's an open job and you know that somebody would be good at it or could be a fit, make sure you have those conversations. And sometimes they won't do it, but just the fact that the company is interested and they know that the company wants them to succeed or expand their capabilities can be a huge boost of confidence for the employee. The job only required one subset of my skills. Even though I offered myself to do more, the company never allowed me to. I left to take a job that used more of my skills. So this goes back to the special projects. No, you can't have everybody meddling in every other department's business all the time, but you can have interdepartmental teams to accomplish goals. So always keep those things in mind when you know there's special tasks that need to be tackled. And then in all of these, I include one that I always find at least somewhat humorous. So this goes to the different kind of work category. This person in their interview said, I left to go start my own pot farm near my house. Okay, so I know this is a hot button topic, and I know it's legal in a number of states. But when I read this interview, I went back and looked where the person lived, and they lived in the state of Tennessee. Growing pot in Tennessee is not legal, so this guy just incriminated himself. I also can't pass it up. So this is related to different type of work. I got to make a dad joke here. This guy, I guess he found himself having a higher calling. Okay. So the career development is the #1 category there. Also, if you all have any questions, comments, or anything, feel free to use the Q&A section that's part of the Zoom app there, or the chat feature. So you can submit questions or point out things there. We'll try to get to those as we approach the end of the session.
Brantley, there was the one question, and I don't want to go too far because I think it's important as we go through these reasons that people understand what this is in terms of the truth. So somebody said, why do you get different reasons 2 weeks after they've left? And I mentioned a few of those, but what we hear repeatedly is that people just simply feel more objective. They don't feel threatened. They're, if they want to talk about their supervisor, they don't feel like they're burning a bridge. There's just all these emotions, and we've talked about it for years, all the emotion of changing jobs and leaving a job. And so there's just so much involved in that we need to give them time to process. And then what we end up getting, and when I say different, let me clarify that a little bit, because a lot of times what we find out is that they'll tell the company I'm leaving for personal reasons. But 2 weeks later, we find out that those personal reasons were in fact a scheduling issue. And so it's that additional amount of specificity that comes after that 2-week period and the objectivity that comes with that really plays into the strength of the data.
Absolutely. So the #2 reason employees are leaving is work-life balance. So what rolls up into this, and the biggest component is schedule, followed by commute and schedule flexibility. I tell you, all three of those are kind of intrinsically tied. But I mean, if employees can find a better job down the street, they will simply go down, or a better schedule down the street, they will simply go down the street and find that job. When you take a look at the percentages, what's interesting is that while commute is not a huge portion, it is increasing a ton. And I think this relates back to the availability of the jobs. If somebody can avoid driving 1 hour to 2 hours to work for a job that's near them, they're going to do that 9 times out of 10, I'm guessing, as long as the job is comparable. And schedule flexibility is interesting. It's dropped by double digits there, and it's significant. What I'm interested in, I have a lot of theories around this, but I think schedule flexibility is one thing that companies might be getting better at. I think the working from home component is becoming a bigger part of our workforce, and so maybe we've made headway there. But the ultimate reality is that, and this is going to continue to be a problem. Danny, often you and I talk about, like, we are in a services economy now, and services economy means that it's all about being available, and schedules can be tough.
Oh, absolutely. And I'm going to go back to the commute, Brantley, because again, at the outset, we talked about the war for talent. Well, Brantley mentioned 1 to 2 hours, but let's face it, even a 30-minute commute versus a 15-minute commute. But if we're a great company to work for, and we've created these incredible opportunities for employees, and we're just, everything's clicking in all cylinders, then that 30 minutes is worth it. But if we're not a great environment to work for, if we aren't doing the right things, then somebody will easily say, well, it's just worth it to me to go commute 15 minutes because it's just easier that way. So people will drive further, but they want to drive further because they're going to somewhere truly great.
Absolutely. So some verbatims from some of these interviews. I left because my schedule, I was working days, nights, and weekends while I was asking for help. The company was letting people go. This one just kind of strikes at my heart just because I feel like this person probably felt like they were drowning and the company wasn't doing anything to help them. I left because of schedule conflicts. The company knew I needed to work nights because I was in school with no notification. I was scheduled for days. This seems like something that is incredibly preventable, but probably fell through the cracks due to maybe a poor manager relationship, a poor manager communication. Because you got to think, if you had a decent employee that needed to work nights and you wanted to keep them, that was something that could be accomplished. So this is more than likely something that fell through the cracks, but this stuff happens on a regular basis. The last one was around commute. The commute was killer, 120 miles each way. I had to buy a camper to stay in a few nights a week. I mean, you want to talk about dedication. I'll do a lot of things for a job I love. I don't know if I'd be doing that anytime soon. I also want to know what happened to that camper when this person left. Did they just leave? Like, I'd love to think there's a camper on a corporate campus that no one knows where it came from and no one knows who it belongs to now. But the schedule flexibility and the work-life balance is absolutely critical. So the number 3 reason, so we finally get around to manager. Everybody always says people leave managers, not companies or jobs. And there's definitely some truth to that. But to put this very, very simply, employees will not tolerate poor manager behavior. And we've been doing this for almost 2 decades now. So if you can imagine something terrible a manager could say or do to an employee, man, we have heard it. So you look at this unprofessionalism, poor employee treatment, lack of support, general behavior, all these things are all symptoms of bad management. And it manifests itself in different ways, but I mean, yes, people will leave because of their managers, but it's not the number 1 reason. So always keep that in mind. But when you take a look at the growth changes here, that unprofessionalism is growing almost out of control since 2010. And I think this is a kind of an output or being yielded because of the job market. As it's getting tougher and tougher to hire people, we have fewer and fewer options for management. So we're putting people in management that maybe have no skills, intent, or desire to do so. And the unfortunate thing is oftentimes, you know, you're promoting the best practitioner, right? You're promoting the best nurse or salesperson, or whatever the case may be, and you're putting them in a management position. Well, now that you've got them promoted, you've got a bad manager, and you've lost a great employee. So you kind of shot yourself in both feet there. But there seems to be a real lack of development around management behavior. And poor communication also continues to go. While it's not a huge percentage, it is continuing to increase. People are expecting to be able to communicate with their leader on a regular basis and in ways that are meaningful to them.
Brantley, back up one slide. You know, I always try and point this out, and I find it kind of interesting. You know, again, we're researchers at heart, so we're trying to code and categorize data into these themes. And I can make the argument that things like poor employee treatment, lack of support, general behavior, poor communication are all elements of professionalism of a manager. What's fascinating is that employees use that word professionalism so often. And they use that word, and a lot of times it's not about the what somebody does, it's the how in which they do it. And so we've created that category, if you will, because it is the way an employee, a manager is actually behaving. And that is absolutely something we can do something about if we were just paying attention.
Yep. So a couple of verbatims, you can imagine some of these are fairly rich, but I tried to keep them pretty straightforward. The company hired a new SVP that was highly unqualified. This is the kind of stuff that your team members can sniff out really immediately when you welcome somebody in that is not qualified for a role. Upper management was awful. We once got an email stating that he would allow us to have Labor Day off. It was a company holiday. Then the email said, you better enjoy it because next week is going to be very rough. What a pleasant place to work. So just make sure, and these things happen, and oftentimes management doesn't even know, you know, in the HR department or a divisional leader won't even know that these things have occurred. And then this one cuts to the quick here. Paula couldn't be more of a jerk and improve the way she speaks to people. So what really is difficult here as an employer is that more than likely the person who left and thought Paula was a jerk is going to remember the company as a jerk. So just remember your frontline managers are are representing the company, in the face of the company, to all those frontline employees. So reason number 4, finally we get to pay, compensation and benefits. And so while this is our number 4 category and it's the number 9 overall category reason there, it is not the number 1. And I'll tell you, and Danny can talk about this further maybe in a minute, but what we find in the realm of compensation is not that people leave it's not that they say it's just pay. Oftentimes it is some variation of, you didn't pay me enough to deal with X. So we will tell you when it comes to comp, we know that not everybody can be the best paying employer in town. But generally what you want to do is you want to take it off the table. Know that you're paying around the market average for that role, and then do everything you can to make the environment as positive as possible based on employee preferences. You can see compensation has not gone up a huge percentage-wise in reasons for leaving. It paying fairly consistent. Find it interesting that benefits has gone up a little bit over the years, although it's not a major contributor. It is something that is starting to crop up more often than it used to. So a couple of verbatims around compensation. They expect you to work for free. They would constantly schedule meetings for hourly employees and not pay you for them. I know there's probably some legal issues there, but this just serves as a reminder. If you have a lot of non-exempt employees, just be conscious of scheduling practices. I think all too often a manager might be exempt and the employees might not be, and they don't think about that when they schedule meetings or activities. The company didn't fulfill the promise of a pay increase once I completed my certification. This is a prime example. Like, yes, pay is what they said in the interview, but it's not necessarily about the pay. It's the fact that they didn't honor their work. So the reason they left here was because they didn't do what they said they were going to do. And then every once in a while, it is simply about the money. Money is not a funny comment. What made this one funny is when I read the entirety of this person's interview, every question they answered, they just said money. So this guy had probably a 5-minute interview where he just said the word money over and over. So some people, it is about the cold hard cash, and that's unavoidable. But I will tell you that is far more in the minority than we would assume.
Brantley, if you could pause just for a second. We had a question about how to read this chart, right? So somebody said, well, the lines below that are bigger than the ones above it. What we're doing is we took the 10 categories. So well-being makes up 8% of why people leave. And then we take that 8% and we break it down. Now, it may not add up to exactly 100% because there's some that become so minuscule that we don't even include in there. But then general personal health, caregiver issues, those all then tend to add up to that 8%. So that's just a clarification on how to read this particular chart as we're going through it. Secondly, somebody asked about what is the makeup of our data. And I wanted to just clarify that this comes from all industries, a pretty good across the board industries. Again, 37,000 exit interviews that were completed. It's about half exempt, half non-exempt. So that gives you a good split between hourly employees and salaried employees. And when we've tried to split it out to look at very specific groupings, we just don't find that the results are that vastly different. And so we think this is a pretty good representation of what's going on in the U.S. right now.
So the number 5 reason for, number 5 category for why employees leave is for personal health reasons. The one high note I always like to emphasize here is while these things may deal with, pregnancy, parental care, child care, personal health, one thing as employers I think we often get lost in is the employee thinks that the company may or may not be flexible with them given these things. And a lot of things we're talking about here are temporary. If it is a sick parent or a family situation. If you have a good employee that is a contributor and you'd like to keep, most companies can find a way to make that happen, but the employees just may not know. They may not know that they can talk to their manager, their director, their HR business partner and figure out a way for them to continue to work there. Of course, that can't happen 100% of the time, but all too often these situations are pretty temporary and we end up losing an employee forever over something that might have lasted 6 months.
And Brantley, I think one of the things to point out here is you got to be careful not to get lost in policy land. You know, we create policies that are so inflexible that it doesn't allow us to do the right thing.
Yep. And you can see the personal health continues to go up. I think people are starting to be more aware and mindful of their own health. So just be flexible with them as much as is reasonable. So job characteristics. This is kind of a tale of two things in my head when I look at this data. First is the general job characteristics. We talked about this a little bit earlier, but is people just don't know what they're getting into oftentimes, whether it's new employees or they feel like they don't know what they're getting into. But sometimes that can be promotions, that can be transfers. So just make sure when people are taking roles that the company's doing everything they can to prepare them as much as possible. Now, a number of these other reasons here, the overload, limited resources, poor training are often indicative of high turnover. If you can improve turnover, this category generally will start to decrease in how often it's showing up. When you look at the percentages here, the general job characteristics is skyrocketing. I think this has to do a lot with the labor market. We just are taking the time maybe to get the people as ready as they can be before they enter the job.
We also are overselling the job and not giving them the truth about it.
Right. Realistic job previews, absolutely critical. A few quotes around this. I never had the resources to do my job. Every time I brought it up, the company said it would be addressed, but it never was. We were always understaffed. This led to higher workloads and tons of pressure. New people were constantly leaving due to the workload. This goes back to the vicious cycle, right? What happens when we have high turnover. This one was just a weird response. So we asked why they leave, and they said, I left on excellent terms. I gave over 2 weeks' notice. I have everything documented if you need to see it. So when we asked why they left, they responded with, I left on excellent terms. And we said, any other information? They go, well, I have everything documented if you need to see it. I have a feeling something weird happened there, and we just don't know. But just a comical response in my book. And then the number 7 category, work environment. So just as with managers, if you can imagine something a terrible a manager could say or do, we've seen it. Same thing with team members. Believe it or not all team members will behave like an adult at all times. Also, this culture employee not a fit is a big reason there. People will self-select out if they don't feel that the company or their teammates are a good fit for them to stay on board long term. The culture employee misfit has grown hugely. While it is a somewhat small percentage in the overall picture, it is skyrocketing. Again, this goes to the fact they have other places they can go. So if they're in your company for 4 or 5 months, they don't feel like they have friends, or they don't feel like it's a culture fit in regards to the values of the organization or the ethics even, they have other options that they can go explore. So some quotes around that. It was a negative work environment. Many employees were hostile towards each other, and none of this was ever recognized by management. But I'm guessing a few of y'all can think of teams or divisions within your company where you know this is going on and maybe nothing's happening. So these are the situations where we got to intervene. The work environment was terrible. They all acted like a bunch of high schoolers. Then it's actually, instead of the ellipses, it actually said long pause in parentheses. So they said no, they acted like middle schoolers. So in the middle of this interview, this person downgraded the team. This one is probably my favorite. There was a cubicle in the office where younger employees would go to make out. It was weird. No joke, it was weird. So if you take nothing else out of this session today, we highly recommend that you walk around your office every once in a while and make sure there's not a makeout cubicle. That just seems like a good, healthy practice to have. Danny mentioned this earlier around the preventable reasons, but when you take a little bit of a deeper dive, we don't want to ignore the fact that managers play a critical role. While they may not be the main reason for leaving, when you look at the more preventable reasons for leaving, a lot of them are manager influenced. So 3/4 of the preventable reasons have some affiliation with the manager. So do know that we know they are kind of a linchpin as it relates to employee retention and are critical.
Good job, Brantley. I know that's a lot of information for you all. Again, I would suggest that you download our retention report so you can actually read through the details and sort of the narrative that we provide you around each of these categories. We did get the question, are these figures the same or comparable to Europe? Well, I can tell you I've looked at other research that's been done in Europe from time to time, and it tends to be the same. But I also can't speak to the quality of the collection of that data in Europe. So I'm reluctant to say yes. I don't think they're going to be vastly different, but I certainly think there are going to be differences. And we certainly see that occasionally when we're doing exit interviews for some of our international companies where they have employees elsewhere, that the issues can be different. And what's really fascinating is that companies are just different in general. A few years ago, we reported on the fact that only 8% of companies actually share the same turnover profile, meaning the top 3 reasons in the same order. So it turns out that individual companies are actually just quite different. So just a couple of additional insights. One of the things that we hear every single day is all about these generational differences. And if there's a millennial on the phone, I'm sure you're sitting there rolling your eyes saying, I wish at some point somebody would just quit talking about millennials. What I want to point out here is that millennials leave for reasons that we would expect based on their career stage. So when we look at career development as a reason for leaving, we would expect younger workers to leave more often because of career. That's just normal. We've all done it throughout our careers for the most part. So that is an issue. But when you look at things like work environment and manager behavior and job characteristics and well-being and all those things, they're slightly different for each of the generations, but we don't see these things that are standout issues related to the millennials that I think a lot of people are trying to boast out there. And the research tells us that there's a lot more similar than there is different. And at the end of the day, we need to simply understand why people are leaving and then address that, and not get overly influenced by trying to categorize people into some generation and then generalize around that. Secondly, first-year turnover continues to be a real challenge. And we've got to do a better job around bringing the right people on and creating great onboarding and doing all those things, because this is also some of the most expensive turnover as well. It costs a lot more to lose somebody at 6 months than it does at 6 years. I know that may be counterintuitive, but that is absolutely the case. So first-year turnover is just a tremendous challenge. I want to end this by really talking about, this call to action, if you will. Again, we've been doing this now and putting this retention report out for 3 years. We are not seeing major shifts, if you will, in terms of the reasons for leaving. There are some elements within the bigger categories that are certainly there. But it just appears to us, not only from the data, but just from the attitude of the companies that we talk to, that there's this reluctance to act, and there's just no urgency around it. And we think there needs to be urgency. There needs to be intentionality around how we retain our employees. So there's a couple of steps that we think really are important. Oh, I'm sorry, I missed this slide. Again, if you look at this, you just see that over the 6 years, these things just aren't changing, or they're getting worse. And so we need to be doing more. So what are these? So step 1. First of all, we just have to realize we have a problem. It's the old adage, I just have to accept that I have a problem. And if we have a problem with retention, we have to identify it, know it, understand it, know what the cost of turnover is, and then we can start to build a strategy and approach for how we improve our retention. Step 2, the employee voice is critical. We cannot assume we know why people are leaving. It is what we do day in and day out. We make assumptions, and we know the old story about assumptions. So data needs to drive our decisions. Step 3 is the analysis. Now, this is one of those things where I think we've got to be really cautious, because we talk about analysis, but we also see paralysis by analysis very, very often. Retention data is challenging. It is a lot of information. It gets spread around to a lot of different departments. We don't always have large percentages of employees in a particular department that have left, even though the turnover percentage might be higher. So we've got to make some assumptions occasionally, but we can make those assumptions based on real data. But more importantly, we have to act. We have to do something. And so analysis needs to drive action. Analysis needs to drive and be driven by data. Step 4, accountability management and action planning. One of the things that we hear more often than not is that our managers simply want to throw the issue back at HR. Either that we're hiring the wrong people, we can't find good people. There's no accountability in our organizations at the operations level generally to improve retention. We have to drive that accountability out into operations. There has to be consequences, if you will, to not improving retention. And then we need to help them with the action planning process based on data so that we can help them to actually improve. And those are absolutely the critical steps. Continuous communications. One of the important things is that we are communicating to employees that it is important that we're addressing retention and that we know why people are leaving and that these are the things that we're doing in order to address those issues. It seems like we're afraid to admit the problem, and then we certainly are afraid to communicate that we have a problem. And this is one of the things that we need to be doing. So we need to have this ongoing communication. And then lastly, there's ongoing collection and evaluation of data. So exit interviews should be something that are done continuously. Stay interviews, engagement studies, all of that is an ongoing collection of data, whether it be monthly, quarterly, annually, because we need to keep evaluating the reasons for leaving, the reasons for staying, how employees feel about the company itself. And one of the fascinating things to me is that we have managed to keep companies for a pretty long time here at the Work Institute as clients. But I've heard so many times that they're leaving and they're not going to do exit interviews anymore because the data never changed. And that really tells me, well, you never did anything. Because if the data is not changing, it means we're not acting on the data itself. And so something else needs to happen. And so this call to action says that there are these 6 steps that you can actually take. They are absolutely necessary steps. We have to find out the truth, and then we have to act on the truth. So hopefully you found this information useful today. It's a lot of information. We realize that. We also know that we've talked really, really fast. We'd love to have a conversation with you. Brantley's a sales guy. He loves to talk, right? And, I'm just an old HR hack, so I like to talk about this stuff as well. So we welcome you reaching out to us and talk about what's going on in your organization, talk about whether we think we can help or not, and, just give you advice and counsel on how you might do a better job of addressing retention in your organization. If you've got questions, we do have just a few minutes here to address those. So I encourage you to use the chat box to submit your question, and we're going to answer a couple of those right now. Brantley?
Yep. So one that came in is great. I know it's a topic that's kind of near and dear to your heart, talking about the millennials. So the question is how are you seeing companies change their hiring patterns and practices just to combat that first-year turnover?
Well, again, I think it goes back to not thinking about it as a generational problem, right? I mean, I think we keep thinking that millennials are just going to leave. Well, that's not necessarily true. The question is, are we creating the conditions where employees want to stay? And are we doing the right selection process? Are we giving realistic job previews? Are we not overselling the job? Are we being patient and getting the right person? So I think that this is, and I hope I don't offend the person that submitted the question, but I think we automatically go to this place of saying, well, this is a millennial problem.
Or this question actually came out of, no, absolutely agreeing that
okay,
it's not
good.
unique. So I think you're good.
I think that this is just representative of the fact that we have to get to the truth. We find out why people are leaving. We can look at this through multiple lenses. We can look at it by age group. We can look at it by department. We can look at it by tenure. We can look at all those things. And if something jumps out at us that we need to address as it relates to a different segmentation of the population, we can certainly do that. But we don't need to just make assumptions around certain generations.
Sounds good. Well, we are wrapping up here. Feel free to submit any more questions. One other thing we love to know is kind of what's on your mind in regards to future topics. I know we have a couple that we're kicking around here for future webinars, but would love to hear something else if y'all have any other topics.
So one question is, we've got any suggestions or evidence to offer on employees in the social services, such as social workers? It's a tough environment and staff gets worn out. I know this is going to sound cliche, but it goes back to data. It goes back to, okay, if you've got those people leaving, let's go do high quality exit interviews and let's understand why are they leaving. Because my guess is that it's different than what we think. And I think there are probably conditions that we could affect and we can change that would make a difference in their overall employment experience. There are tough jobs. There are lots of tough jobs out there, but we also have seen over and over that we've got companies that have people in very tough jobs that have very low turnover because they've addressed all the things that can be addressed. They've addressed those issues and have created a truly great environment.
So Danny, the next question is around kind of the figures that we've assigned to turnover. And I know you talked earlier about the 15,000 number, and that seems low to some people, and we honestly think it is too. But could you kind of talk again about what goes into that figure and what else could be on the table that's not in there?
Yeah, I mean, you know, SHRM puts out a number that says 1.5 times. I've seen numbers that said 2.5 times. I mean, the reality is that every company and every job is a little different. You know, if I'm trying to hire for a chief operating officer and I'm using an outside search firm, the cost of hiring alone is tremendous, right? It's 30% of their base pay. And then we've got all the other things that we need to do and the opportunity cost that you mentioned. So there are so many factors that go into cost of turnover. What we find is that if we are more conservative in addressing this issue, then we usually get better buy-in from the organization. If we start trying to, for lack of a better word, bloat that number, then people start to dismiss it as not being believable. So that's why we take that more conservative approach of 33% of base pay. And again, a third of that being hard cost. There is plenty of proof out there that it costs at least $5,000 just to hire a person. And that's just in hiring cost alone. And that is a very reasonable and real number. It doesn't take us long to add those numbers up. So we just try not to get overly aggressive because we want to get buy-in from the organization. So I think that's really what it boils down to. Well, we really appreciate you joining us today. Hopefully you've learned something. Hopefully this is useful information. Again, I want to point out that oftentimes we actually do come into companies and give this type of presentation if that's of interest to you. Sometimes it's just that added information that needs to go out to your executive team or to your operations teams that helps them understand the marketplace that we're dealing with right now and some of this real reasons why employees leave. So definitely look forward to talking to you. And again, if you've got some topics or some ideas about things that you think we might need to address, feel free to shoot us an email. You can send that to me at DannyNelms@workinstitute.com, or there are contact information on our website. Feel free to reach out to us.
Yep. So thank you all so much for joining. We're going to be doing the next webinar on June 19th. It's actually going to be a little bit more solutions oriented around conducting the research and taking action in your organization. It's kind of an approach that we refer to as retention remediation. So we're going to go in a little bit about us and how we do that work to help organizations tackle turnover in a manageable way. So again, that's going to be June 19th. We hope you all can join us. Again, you can register for that, and if you can't attend, you can get the recording of it afterwards. But thank you all so much for joining. We hope it was helpful, and hopefully we get to connect with you all somewhere down the line. Thank you so much, and have a great rest of your Thursday.